A divorced mom inherits a worthless mine at least. That's what everyone told her. But when her dogs started digging near the crumbling shaft, they found something shocking. Buried in the dirt wasn't treasure, but a human hand clutching a locket inside. A faded photo of her own mother as a child. What was her family hiding on this storm-battered island? Why did locals whisper about curses? And why did her grandmother leave her this place in the first place? The deeper she goes into the mine, the more chilling the discoveries become: abandoned journals, wartime secrets, and a truth powerful enough to change her life forever. Will this broken mother uncover the hidden legacy that could finally bring her healing? Or will the island's deadly storms bury the truth for good? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. As Sarah clutched the worn leather leash tighter. As the ferry cut through the choppy waters, her loyal companion Max, a scruffy brown mutt with soulful eyes, pressed against her legs as salt spray misted their faces. The wooden benches creaked beneath them, matching the uneasy rhythm of her thoughts. Two elderly women huddled nearby, their whispers carrying across the deck like seagulls' cries. That's her, Martha Wilson's granddaughter. Poor thing doesn't know what she's getting into with that cursed mine. Sarah's chest tightened. The inheritance had come as a shock. A house, an abandoned mine from a grandmother she'd met only twice, after Tom left her for his young secretary 6 months ago, leaving their savings account drained. She'd had no choice but to accept this mysterious gift. Worthless hole in the ground. The other woman muttered, "Nothing but trouble since the collapse back in '68. Max's ears perked up at their words. He'd been unusually alert since they'd boarded the ferry, his dark eyes fixed on the approaching island. Sarah absently scratched behind his ears, trying to calm both him and her jangling nerves. The island's silhouette grew larger, its jagged cliffs rising from the sea like broken teeth. Waves crashed against the rocky shore, sending white spray high into the air. Near the top of the tallest cliff stood a weathered wooden house, its gray siding almost disappearing against the overcast sky. "That's to be our new home, boy," Sarah whispered. The words felt strange in her mouth, like trying to speak a foreign language. Max suddenly lunged forward, nearly pulling the leash from her grip. His sharp barks echoed across the water as he strained toward the approaching dock. Several passengers turned to stare, and Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "Quiet, Max," she commanded, but the dog continued to bark, his tail rigid with excitement or anxiety. She couldn't tell which. The ferry docked with a heavy thud, and Sarah gathered their meager belongings to suitcases and a box of kitchen essentials. The rest would arrive by moving truck tomorrow. As they made their way down the slippery ramp, the locals gave them a wide berth, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and something that looked unsettlingly like pity. The climb to the house was steep, following a winding dirt path that seemed to have been carved into the very cliff face. Sarah's legs burned, and she had to stop twice to catch her breath. Max pulled ahead impatiently, somehow energized by the ascent. When they finally reached the house, Sarah's heart sank. Up close, the damage was more apparent: peeling paint, loose shutters, missing shingles. The small front porch sagged like a tired smile. But the view was breathtaking. The entire bay spread out before them, white caps dotting the steel-gray water like scattered diamonds. The key was exactly where the lawyer said it would be, tucked behind a loose brick near the front door. The lock stuck at first, protesting with a rusty screech before finally giving way inside. The air was stale and thick with dust. Sheets covered the furniture like shrouds, and cobwebs decorated every corner. But beneath the neglect, Sarah could see hints of what must have once been a warm and welcoming home. Wide windows, a stone fireplace, built-in bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. "Well, Max," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space, "I guess we should start unpacking what we have." She began with the kitchen, wanting to at least have a few essentials ready for their first night. As she unwrapped plates and cups, placing them in cupboards that desperately needed cleaning, she tried to imagine her grandmother moving through the same space. What had made the stern-faced woman in the few photographs Sarah owned choose such an isolated spot? And why had she left it all to a granddaughter she barely knew? The sun was setting when Max's behavior suddenly changed. He'd been exploring the house room by room, but now he stood at the back door, whining urgently. Sarah opened it, thinking he needed a bathroom break, but the moment she did, he bolted into the overgrown backyard. "Max," she called, hurrying after him. The yard ended abruptly at a chain-link fence topped with warning signs. Beyond it, she could see the collapsed entrance to the mine shaft, partially hidden by thick vegetation. Max ignored her calls, running straight to his spot near the fence and beginning to dig with frantic intensity. His paws threw dirt in all directions as he burrowed deeper and deeper. Sarah had never seen him so focused, so determined. Usually, his digging was playful, more about the activity than any real goal. This was different. He dug as if his life depended on it, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. "Max, stop," Sarah commanded, but her voice lacked conviction. Something about his urgency made her hesitate to interfere. The sun sank lower behind the cliffs, casting long shadows across the yard. But Max continued his desperate excavation, his normally pristine white paws now caked with dark soil. Sarah stood watching, her arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill, as her dog dug deeper into the earth near the mine that everyone called worthless. But if it was truly worthless, she wondered, why did the locals seem so afraid of it? And why was Max so determined to uncover whatever lay buried in its shadow? The old house creaked behind her, as if sharing secrets with the wind, while ahead of her, Max's digging became even more intense, sending clouds of dirt into the deepening twilight. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Sarah woke to find Max's bed empty, and her heart sank when she peered through the window. There he was, still digging in the same spot as last night, his white fur now completely brown from the dirt. "Max, enough," she called, hurrying outside in her pajamas and worn slippers. The morning air bit at her skin, carrying the salty tang of the ocean mixed with the earthy smell of freshly turned soil. But as she approached to drag him away, something caught her eye, weathered wooden beams poking through the earth like ancient bones. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knelt beside Max, who paused his digging to look at her with intelligent eyes, as if saying, "See, I told you there was something here. Good boy," she whispered, patting his dirty head. Then, despite her better judgment, she began to dig alongside him, her fingers sinking into the cool, damp earth. The soil here was different, looser, disturbed. This wasn't natural ground. Something lay buried beneath. Her fingers struck metal, and she carefully brushed away more dirt. A rusted pickaxe emerged, its handle rotted away but the head still intact. Next came a shovel head, equally corroded by time. Her heart began to race as she uncovered more tools, pieces of mining equipment, that told a story of work abruptly abandoned. Then her hands found something different, a wooden plank, somehow preserved better than the tool handles. As she pulled it free, she noticed strange markings carved into its surface. They weren't random scratches. They looked deliberate, like some kind of code or message. "Well, look who's made themselves at home," a gruff voice called out. Sarah jumped, clutching the plank to her chest as she turned. 3 locals stood at her back gate, 2 older men and a woman, all wearing expressions that mixed concern with disapproval. They carried boxes and bags, supplies, she realized, remembering the moving truck was due today. "We brought your things," the woman said, her gray hair tucked under a faded baseball cap. "But honey, you shouldn't be digging there. These are just old mining tools," Sarah said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. Max moved closer to her legs, eyeing the newcomers warily. The taller of the 2 men shook his head. "That mine's cursed," he said flatly. "Has been since the day it collapsed. Best leave it sealed." "Cursed?" Sarah couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "It's just an old copper mine." "Copper wasn't all they found down there," the second man said, his voice dropping. "Some things are better left buried. Your grandmother knew that." Sarah looked down at the carved plank in her hands. "My grandmother never talked about this place. I barely knew her. Maybe there was a reason for that," the woman said gently. "Look, we'll help you bring in your things. But take our advice, leave the mine alone." They spent the next hour carrying boxes into the house, the locals pointedly avoiding any further discussion of the mine or Sarah's grandmother. They worked efficiently, and Sarah noticed how they seemed to know their way around the house, as if they'd been here before. But whenever she tried to ask questions, they changed the subject or gave vague answers. As they prepared to leave, the woman, who had introduced herself as Martha, paused at the door. "Your grandmother was a good woman," she said quietly, "but she carried heavy burdens. Don't go digging up what she worked so hard to bury." Sarah watched them walk away, their words echoing in her mind. The carved plank seemed to grow heavier in her hands. That night, sleep proved elusive. Sarah sat in her grandmother's old armchair, a single lamp casting a warm glow over the strange plank in her lap. The markings seemed to shift in the dim light, revealing new patterns with each turn. Why had her grandmother left her this place? What secrets lay buried in that mine? Outside, Max's bark pierced the darkness, that same urgent, insistent bark from before. He was at the shaft again, she knew without looking. Sarah traced the carved symbols with her finger, wondering what message they held. Her grandmother had chosen to leave this to her, specifically her, when she could have sold it years ago. There had to be a reason. The dog's barking grew more intense, echoing off the cliffs and seeming to make the old house itself shudder. Sarah held the plank closer to the light, studying each mark, each groove. In the yellow lamplight, they almost seemed to tell a story, if only she knew how to read it. Max's barking continued, a desperate call that seemed to bridge the gap between past and present, between what was buried and what yearned to be found. Sarah sat in the pool of lamplight, caught between her grandmother's silent legacy and her dog's urgent warnings, while outside, the night held onto its secrets. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she pulled on thick work gloves in the gray morning light. She barely slept, but determination drove her forward. Max stood alert beside her, his tail wagging with anticipation as she gathered supplies from the old shed, a sturdy flashlight, coils of rope, and a backpack filled with water and basic tools. "We're going to be careful, boy," she murmured, checking the flashlight's beam. The weight of the locals' warning still pressed on her mind, but something deeper pulled her forward, a need to understand why her grandmother had left her this inheritance. The collapsed mine entrance was partially visible now, thanks to their earlier digging. Sarah worked methodically, clearing away loose dirt and rocks while Max paced nearby, occasionally pawing at the ground. The old support beams she'd uncovered yesterday looked solid enough, though weathered by time. As she cleared the last pile of debris from the entrance, a cool draft whispered from the darkness, carrying the musty scent of earth and age. Max's ears perked up, and he moved closer to the opening, sniffing intently. "Stay close to me," Sarah instructed, securing her backpack and switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing rough-hewn walls that disappeared into shadow. She tied one end of the rope to a sturdy tree near the entrance, letting the other end trail behind her as a safety line. The tunnel narrowed quickly, forcing Sarah to duck her head. Max stayed right at her heels, his claws clicking against stone. The air grew cooler, and their breath formed small clouds in the flashlight beam. The walls pressed in close, slick with moisture in some places. As they ventured deeper, Sarah's flashlight caught something unusual on the tunnel wall. She moved closer, running her gloved hand over the surface. Carved into the rock were symbols similar to those on the wooden plank she'd found. Deliberate marks that couldn't be natural formation. "Look at this, Max," she whispered, tracing the symbols with her finger. They seemed to form a pattern, leading deeper into the tunnel. Some looked like waves, others like intricate knots. They reminded her of old sailing charts she'd seen in museums. Max whined softly, pushing past her to nose at something ahead. Sarah followed, her flashlight beam revealing more symbols along the walls. The tunnel opened slightly into what must have been a work area. Old timber supports created a rough framework, and the remains of ancient mining equipment lay scattered about. Something caught her eye in the beam of light, a corner of wood protruding from the packed earth of the tunnel floor. Sarah knelt down, carefully brushing away dirt and small stones. A box began to take shape, old but surprisingly intact, about the size of a large book. "Good boy," she praised Max, who watched intently as she excavated the box. It was crafted from dark wood, with metal bindings that had turned green with age. A simple lock, now rusted, held it closed. In the flashlight's beam, she could make out faded initials carved into the lid. Sarah's heart pounded as she examined the box. The wood felt damp but solid, preserved by the cool, constant temperature of the mine. The lock was firmly rusted shut, but age had weakened one corner where the wood had begun to separate. Working carefully with a small pry bar from her pack, she eased the damaged corner apart. The wood creaked but gave way, revealing a small space inside. Sarah shone her flashlight through the opening, catching glimpses of paper, sheets that had been carefully folded and tucked away. With trembling fingers, she reached inside and drew out what appeared to be pages from a journal. The paper was delicate but still readable, protected from complete decay by the box. In faded ink, she could make out a careful hand. The secret must be kept safe from the sea. They searched still, though generations have passed. What was taken cannot be returned, but it must be protected at all cost. Max pressed against her leg, and Sarah realized she'd been holding her breath. The words seemed to echo in the close tunnel, carrying the weight of long-buried secrets. She carefully folded the pages and tucked them into her backpack, then gathered the box as well. Whatever mystery her grandmother had left her, these pages might hold the key to understanding it. The symbols on the walls seemed to watch them as Sarah and Max made their way back toward daylight. Following the safety rope through the twisting tunnel, the draft from the entrance grew stronger, carrying with it the distant sound of waves, a reminder of the sea that seemed to play such an important role in the journal's cryptic warning. Sarah spread the damp journal pages carefully across her kitchen table, using soft cloths to gently blot away the moisture. The evening sun streaming through the windows cast a warm glow over the fragile paper as she worked. Max lay nearby, his chin resting on his paws, watching her with attentive eyes. As the pages dried, the handwriting became clearer. Sarah's hands trembled as she recognized the distinctive loops and curves, the same elegant script She remembered from the few birthday cards and holiday letters her grandmother had sent over the years. Though they'd grown apart, she kept every piece of correspondence tucked away in a box at home. "It's definitely her writing," Sarah whispered to Max, running her finger along the faded ink. The discovery sent a shiver down her spine. What secrets had her grandmother been keeping in these mine tunnels? Why had she chosen to share them now, after all these years of silence? The journal entries were frustratingly incomplete, fragments of a larger story that seemed to revolve around something precious that needed protection. The mentions of the sea and searching generations nagged at Sarah's mind, refusing to let her rest. After a fitful night's sleep filled with dreams of dark tunnels and mysterious symbols, Sarah packed her backpack with fresh batteries for her flashlight, water, and basic tools. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when she and Max made their way back to the mine entrance. "We need to go deeper this time," she told Max, who wagged his tail in response. The safety rope was still secured where she'd left it the day before. Sarah tested it carefully before leading the way into the darkness. They passed the area where they'd found the box, the carved symbols on the walls now familiar guides. The tunnel continued beyond, sloping gently downward. The air grew noticeably cooler, and the sounds of their movement echoed strangely in the confined space. Sarah's flashlight beam played across the walls, revealing more symbols and occasional timber supports. The tunnel showed signs of having been thoroughly worked. This wasn't just an exploratory shaft, but a place where miners had spent considerable time. After about 15 minutes of careful progress, the tunnel widened into another work area. Sarah swept her flashlight around, documenting every detail. The beam caught something pale against the dark earth, something that made her heart skip a beat. "What is that?" she whispered, moving closer. Max whined softly beside her. Protruding from the packed soil of the tunnel floor was what appeared to be white bone. Sarah's first thought was that it might be animal remains, but as she knelt down for a closer look, her breath caught in her throat. The shape was unmistakably human, the delicate bones of fingers reaching out from the earth, as if grasping for help. With trembling hands, Sarah began to carefully brush away the soil around the skeletal hand. She worked slowly, reverently, aware that she was uncovering someone's remains. As more of the hand was revealed, she noticed something clutched within its bony grip, a metal object, dark with age and corrosion, a locket. She breathed, carefully examining the tarnished piece of jewelry. It was oval-shaped, about the size of a small egg, with traces of what might once have been an ornate design on its surface. The skeletal fingers held it in a grip that had lasted decades. Sarah documented the position with photos from her phone before gently working to free the locket. It took several minutes of careful manipulation before she could ease it from the skeletal grasp, without disturbing the bones more than necessary. The locket was heavier than she expected, its surface rough with corrosion. Her hands shook as she examined it in the flashlight beam. Despite its years underground, she could feel that the hinge mechanism was still intact. The clasp, however, had fused shut with age and rust. Sarah bit her lip, considering. This was evidence. Perhaps she should wait for proper authorities. But something deep inside urged her to know now, to understand why her grandmother had led her here through the trail of clues. Using her small multi-tool, she carefully worked at the seized clasp. It resisted at first, then suddenly gave way with a small snap that echoed in the tunnel. Sarah held her breath as she eased the locket open. Protected inside from the worst effects of time and moisture was a small photograph. Though faded and yellowed with age, the image was still clear enough to recognize. Sarah gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. The photograph showed a little girl of perhaps 6 or 7 years old, wearing a dress that spoke of another era. But Sarah would have known that face anywhere. The same face she saw in her own childhood photo albums. The little girl in the locket was her mother. Sarah's hands trembled as she wrapped the locket in a clean handkerchief and tucked it into her jacket pocket. Max stayed close to her side as they made their way into the small coastal town, his usual bouncy demeanor subdued as if sensing her emotional turmoil. The morning fog had lifted, revealing a row of weathered storefronts along the main street. A few locals were out, starting their daily routines. Sarah pulled the locket out, gathering her courage before approaching a group of older women chatting outside the post office. "Excuse me," she said, carefully unwrapping the tarnished piece. "I found this in the old mine, and I was wondering if..." The women's reactions were immediate and unsettling. 2 of them physically stepped back, making signs to ward off evil. The third simply turned and walked away without a word. Max whined softly, pressing against Sarah's leg, confused and slightly shaken. Sarah continued down the street. Similar scenes played out as she showed the locket to others. Some people hurried away, while others muttered excuses and refused to meet her eyes. The few who did look at the locket quickly averted their gaze, as if the mere sight of it brought bad luck. Finally, She pushed open the door of Morton's General Store, the bell above tinkling cheerfully despite the heavy atmosphere that seemed to follow her. The elderly shopkeeper, Mr. Morton, was arranging cans on a shelf, his movements deliberate and careful. "Mr. Morton." Sarah approached the counter, Max padding quietly beside her. "I need to ask you about something I found." The old man turned slowly, his weathered face creased with both age and concern. When Sarah placed the wrapped locket on the counter, his expression darkened. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the mine." "It was." Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It was with some remains." Mr. Morton's face paled. He leaned heavily on his counter, eyes fixed on the handkerchief-wrapped locket. "There were families," he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "Good families. Just disappeared one winter. Never found out why." He shook his head slowly. "Some say they tried to leave by sea. Others say he trailed off, his eyes distant." "What others say?" Sarah pressed gently. The bell above the door chimed again, and a man in his early 50s entered, carrying a leather briefcase. He paused, observing the scene before him with keen interest. "Pardon me," he said, approaching the counter, "but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm Professor James Wilson, visiting from the Maritime History Department at the university. Did you mention finding something in the old mine?" Sarah studied him carefully. His tweed jacket had seen better days, but his eyes were sharp and kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. Max, usually wary of strangers, gave a tentative wag of his tail. "Yes," Sarah said, unwrapping the locket. "Along with these markings." She pulled out her phone to show him the photos of the carved symbols from the mine walls. The historian's eyes widened with genuine excitement. "These markings, they're similar to ones found in other coastal mines from the same era. But these are different somehow." He looked up at Sarah. "Would you be willing to show me where you found them?" Mr. Morton made a sound of protest, but Professor Wilson continued. "I've been researching disappearances along this coast for years. These symbols might be connected to old smuggling routes used during Prohibition." Sarah glanced at Mr. Morton, who had turned back to his shelves, shoulders tense. The historian seemed genuine in his interest, and Sarah desperately needed answers. "I'd appreciate any help you can offer," she said. They exchanged contact information and agreed to meet the next morning to examine the mine together. That evening, Sarah sat in front of the crackling fireplace in her grandmother's house. Max sprawled contentedly at her feet. The dog's steady breathing was comforting as she carefully spread out the fragments of the journal they found in the wooden box. The pages were brittle with age, requiring delicate handling. Some passages were clear, while others had been damaged by time and moisture. But what she could read made her blood run cold. "The children must be moved tonight." One passage read, "The customs men are suspicious. Jenkins betrayed us to save his own skin." Another fragment mentioned the darkness below is safer than the storm above and smugglers' tunnels that run deeper than any mine shaft. Sarah's hands shook as she pieced together more fragments. "3 families trusted us with their little ones. God help me. We had no choice but to hide them in darkness. The storm rages outside, and they're searching the coast." Max lifted his head suddenly, ears perked toward the window. Sarah froze, listening to the wind outside, wondering what secrets still lay buried in the darkness of her grandmother's mine. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Sarah heard a knock at her door. Professor Bennett stood there, equipped with a professional-grade flashlight and a weathered leather satchel. His eyes sparkled with scholarly excitement. "I hope I'm not too early," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "I could hardly sleep thinking about those markings you described." Max bounded to the door, his tail wagging with unusual enthusiasm for a stranger. Sarah grabbed her own flashlight and the crude map she'd sketched of the mine's main tunnel. "I marked where I found the most visible symbols," she explained as they walked the worn path to the mine entrance. The morning dew dampened their shoes, and a salty breeze carried the distant cry of seabirds. Inside the mine, their flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Professor Bennett moved slowly, methodically, studying each marking with intense concentration. He ran his fingers over the carved symbols, occasionally consulting a small notebook. "These aren't random," he muttered, excitement creeping into his voice. "See how they form patterns? This one here," he pointed to a series of crossed lines, "indicates a direction, and these curved marks often suggested hidden spaces." Max trotted ahead, his nails clicking against the stone floor. He seemed unusually focused, as if following some scent only he could detect. "The construction is fascinating," Professor Bennett continued, running his hand along the rough-hewn walls. "This wasn't just a mining operation. These tool marks, they're different, more recent than the original mine work." Sarah's flashlight beam caught something unusual, a section of wall that looked slightly different from the rest. The professor noticed it too, moving closer to examine the seam where the rock face met what appeared to be carefully placed wooden beams. "This is intentional," he said quietly. "These beams aren't support structures, they're camouflage." Together, they began carefully removing the rotted wood. Behind it, a narrow tunnel opened up, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Before either of them could react, Max darted into the opening, his excited barks echoing from within. "Max," Sarah called out, concern evident in her voice. The dog's barking continued, but now it had a different tone, not fearful, but insistent. "He's found something," Professor Bennett said. "Shall we?" Sarah went first, sidling through the tight passage. The beam of her flashlight revealed rough walls that gradually widened into a larger space. As she emerged from the tunnel, she gasped. They had discovered an underground chamber, roughly the size of her grandmother's living room. Wooden crates of various sizes were stacked against the walls. Old hurricane lanterns sat on makeshift shelves, their glass clouded with decades of dust. Scattered among the crates were personal belongings, a child's worn shoe, a tattered blanket, a tin cup still sitting on a wooden box as if its owner had just stepped away. This was a shelter, Professor Bennett whispered, his voice filled with awe. A hiding place? Max nosed around the chamber, sniffing at the crates with great interest. Sarah approached one of the larger boxes, her heart pounding. Using a rusty crowbar they found nearby, she carefully pried up one corner of the lid. Dust billowed up as the wood creaked open. Sarah brushed away years of grime with her sleeve, revealing the contents within. Gold and silver coins caught the flashlight beam, tarnished but still gleaming. Stacks of kin rations, their labels faded beyond recognition, filled one side of the crate. And there, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of letters. Their wax seals still intact after all these years. Professor Bennett let out a low whistle. "This isn't just contraband," he said softly. "This is history. These supplies, they were likely meant for resistance operations. The letters might tell us who was involved, what they were doing here." Sarah picked up one of the sealed letters with trembling fingers, holding it carefully as if it might crumble to dust. In the beam of her flashlight, she could make out her grandmother's distinctive handwriting on the envelope. The chamber held an almost sacred silence, broken only by Max's occasional snuffling as he continued his investigation of the space. The air was thick with more than just dust. It was heavy with the weight of long-buried secrets, of lives disrupted, of choices made in desperate times. "Your grandmother," Professor Bennett said gently. "She must have been part of something much bigger than anyone realized. This chamber, it wasn't just for storage. People hid here, lived here, even if only temporarily." Sarah nodded, unable to find words as she surveyed the room. Every object seemed to tell a story, the carefully organized supplies, the personal items left behind in what must have been a hurried departure, the letters that might finally explain why her grandmother had chosen her to inherit this property. The crate's contents painted a picture of wartime desperation and careful planning. Someone, her grandmother, had created this hidden sanctuary, stocking it with everything needed to sustain life and perhaps support some greater cause. The coins suggested a financial network. The rations spoke of preparation for extended hiding. And those letters, still sealed after all these years, promised answers to questions Sarah hadn't even known to ask. Back in the house, Sarah and Professor Bennett sat at her grandmother's old kitchen table, carefully examining the letters by lamplight. The warm glow cast dancing shadows on the walls as they gently broke the wax seals, taking care not to damage the fragile paper within. "These date back to 1943, Professor Bennett said softly, adjusting his reading glasses. "Your great-grandparents were involved in something remarkable here." Sarah leaned forward, reading over his shoulder. The first letter detailed how 3 families had sought refuge in the mine shaft, hiding from conscription officers who were forcibly recruiting young men for the war effort. Her great-grandparents had taken them in without hesitation. "Listen to this," she said, her voice trembling as she read aloud. "The Hendersons arrived last night with nothing but what they could carry. Their boy Thomas is only 16, but the officers don't care anymore. They're taking anyone who can hold a rifle. We couldn't turn them away." Professor Bennett nodded gravely. Many families faced impossible choices during those times. Some chose to hide their sons rather than send them to what they feared would be certain death. They continued reading through the letters, each one revealing more details about the hidden resistance network her family had been part of. The mine shaft had become a sanctuary for those fleeing conscription, with her great-grandparents coordinating supply deliveries and maintaining contact with other sympathetic families along the coast. As they worked their way through the pile of correspondence, Sarah noticed something poking out from behind an old cabinet. "What's this?" She reached over and carefully pulled out a large bundle wrapped in faded fabric. Unfolding it revealed a handmade quilt, its colors dulled by time but still beautiful. Delicate embroidery decorated the corners, initials carefully stitched into each square. "These must be the families they helped," Sarah whispered, running her fingers over the threadwork. "Look, H for Henderson, M for Morrison." Their exploration yielded more artifacts: a pair of small leather shoes, worn at the toes and carefully patched, a wooden toy horse, lovingly carved with remarkable detail despite its simple tools, a child's spinning top, its paint chipped but still bearing traces of bright colors. "Each of these items tells a story," Professor Bennett said, holding the toy horse up to the light. "These weren't just refugees passing through. They lived here long enough to leave pieces of their lives behind." Sarah picked up another letter, this one water-stained and harder to read. "The children try to stay quiet during the day, but it's hard for them to understand why they can't go outside. Mary Henderson has been teaching them their lessons in whispers. Sometimes we can hear them singing very softly when we bring down supplies." The professor cleared his throat, clearly moved. "Your great-grandparents weren't just offering shelter. They were helping preserve these families' humanity under impossible circumstances." As they continued sorting through the items, Sarah's hand brushed against something that felt different, a single page, torn from what appeared to be a diary. The handwriting was shaky, written in what looked like haste. Her heart caught in her throat as she read the words, "If anyone finds this, know we gave everything to keep them safe. May our blood not be in vain." The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled over them. Sarah carefully placed the page on the table, her hands trembling slightly. These weren't just historical artifacts they were uncovering. This was her family's legacy, a testament to courage and sacrifice in the face of moral crisis. "Your great-grandparents were heroes," Professor Bennett said quietly. "They risked everything, their safety, their lives, to protect these families." Sarah nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The letters, the toys, the quilt, each item painted a picture of lives interrupted, of families forced into hiding, and of the extraordinary compassion of those who chose to help them. Her great-grandparents had transformed a simple mine shaft into a sanctuary, creating a hidden community of hope in the darkness. She picked up another letter, this one describing how her great-grandmother would sing lullabies down the mine shaft on nights when the children couldn't sleep, her voice carrying comfort through the darkness. These small acts of kindness, preserved in faded ink and carefully folded paper, brought tears to her eyes. The lamplight flickered, casting warm shadows across the collected artifacts spread out before them, each item a piece of a larger story of courage, compassion, and sacrifice. Sarah realized that she hadn't inherited just a property or an old mine. She had inherited a sacred trust, a story that needed to be preserved and remembered. Professor Bennett carefully gathered the letters into chronological order, his academic training evident in his methodical approach. "These documents are invaluable," he said. "They provide a unique perspective on a part of history that often goes unrecorded. The quiet acts of resistance, the ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things." Sarah held the torn diary page again, reading those final words once more. "If anyone finds this, know we gave everything to keep them safe. May our blood not be in vain." The weight of that legacy settled over her like a mantle, and she knew that discovering these secrets was just the beginning of her journey. Sarah walked down the town's main street, her boots clicking against the weathered boardwalk. The morning fog had lifted, revealing a cluster of local shops with their faded signs and weather-beaten awnings. She pushed open the door to Miller's General Store, the bell chiming overhead. "Well, if it isn't the mine owner herself," old Joe Miller said from behind the counter, his tone warm but carrying an edge of something else. "Heard you've been doing some exploring up there." Sarah nodded, gathering supplies for the day. "Yes, we've found some interesting things. Letters and artifacts from during the war." A woman sorting through canned goods nearby turned sharply. "Those letters tell the whole truth, do they?" Her voice was bitter. "My grandmother used to talk about how those tunnels were used for more than just hiding folks. Said some people got rich off others' misfortune." "That's not true, Martha," another customer interrupted. It was Ben Thompson, the hardware store owner. "My father knew Sarah's great-grandparents. They were good people who risked everything to help others, never took a penny for their trouble." The tension in the store grew thick as molasses. Sarah listened as more townspeople joined the debate, each seeming to have their own version of events. Some spoke of her ancestors with reverence, describing midnight rescues and secret supply runs. Others muttered about mysterious disappearances and unexplained wealth. "They saved my aunt's family," one elderly man declared firmly. "Hid them for 3 months in those tunnels when the authorities were searching house to house." "Oh yeah," Martha countered. "Then how do you explain the gold coins that showed up in their possession after the war? Where'd that come from, if they were so noble?" Sarah's head spun with the conflicting accounts. She paid for her supplies quickly and headed back to the house, her dog trotting faithfully beside her. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the wind was picking up strength. By nightfall, the storm hit with full force. The old house creaked and groaned under the assault of powerful gusts. Rain lashed against the windows like angry fist, while thunder crashed overhead with such force it made the floorboards vibrate. Sarah's dog pressed against her legs, whimpering at particularly loud thunderclaps. She stroked his head reassuringly, though she felt far from calm herself. The wind howled through every crack and crevice, creating an eerie whistling sound that seemed to echo the conflicting voices from town. "It's okay, boy," she murmured, wrapping a blanket around herself as they huddled in the living room. The old house shuddered with each powerful gust, and she could hear things hitting the roof, small branches and debris carried by the fierce wind. The storm raged throughout the night. Sleep was impossible as the windows rattled in their frames, and the wind screamed like a living thing. Sarah's dog remained alert, his ears perking up at every new sound, his body tense against her side. She thought about the stories she'd heard in town. Heroes or opportunists? Saviors or profiteers? The truth felt as murky as the storm-tossed sea below the cliffs. The letters they'd found painted one picture, but the townspeople's memories told different tales. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a particularly violent thunderclap, followed by a deep rumbling sound that seemed to come from the direction of the mine. Sarah's dog began barking frantically, pawing at the door despite the howling wind outside. "No, boy," she said firmly, holding him back. "We can't go out there now. We'll check in the morning." The night seemed endless, but eventually the storm began to lose its fury. As the first gray light of dawn crept over the horizon, Sarah opened the front door, her dog immediately bounding out ahead of her. The damage was immediately apparent. Tree branches littered the yard, and part of the garden fence had collapsed. But it was the mine entrance that made her heart sink. Where there had been a clear opening just yesterday, now there was a jumble of broken beams and fresh earth. The storm had triggered a collapse, burying at least half of the tunnel entrance. Sarah approached slowly, her boots squelching in the mud. The old support beams, weakened by decades of exposure and moisture, had finally given way under the storm's fury. Splintered wood stuck out at odd angles from the pile of dirt and debris that now blocked much of the passage they'd so carefully cleared. Her dog sniffed around the edges of the collapse, whining softly. The secrets they'd been uncovering, the mysteries they'd been piecing together. How much of it was now buried under tons of soil and stone? And perhaps more importantly, which version of her family's story was the truth? The rising sun cast long shadows across the debris, highlighting the devastation. Half their discoveries, half the evidence that might have helped separate fact from fiction, now lay buried beneath the earth. Sarah stood there, watching as morning light slowly illuminated the full extent of the damage, while her dog continued his anxious inspection of the collapsed entrance. Sarah wasted no time wallowing in despair. With determined hands, she gathered everything she could think of from the old house, shovels from the garden shed, coils of sturdy rope, and every working flashlight and lantern she could find. Her dog watched intently as she loaded the supplies into a wheelbarrow. The historian arrived just as she was heading toward the mine entrance, his own arms full of equipment. "I came as soon as I heard about the collapse," he said, setting down a box of tools. "We can't let all this history be lost." To her surprise, several locals appeared shortly after, trudging up the path with additional shovels and support beams. These weren't the same ones who had warned her away. These were the quieter ones, the ones who had listened to her stories with thoughtful eyes. "My grandmother used to tell me about how your family helped during the war," said one weather-worn fisherman, rolling up his sleeves. "Least we can do is help preserve that history." They worked methodically, first securing the remaining support beams to prevent further collapse. The historian directed their efforts, pointing out where additional bracing was needed. "The tide's been eating away at this cliff for decades," he explained, wiping sweat from his brow. "We need to work quickly, but carefully." Sarah's dog stayed close, occasionally pawing at specific spots in the rubble as if trying to guide them. The team dug through layers of mud and broken timbers, passing buckets of debris down a human chain. Every so often, someone would find something significant: a rusted tool, a fragment of paper, pieces of the past emerging from the earth. The work was exhausting, but Sarah refused to take more than short breaks. The tide was their enemy now, each wave below eating away at the cliff's foundation. The historian shared her sense of urgency, constantly checking the structural integrity of their progress. "Look at these marks," he said, pointing to some exposed beams. "Your ancestors knew what they were doing. These supports were designed to last. It's only decades of salt water and storms that finally weakened them." As they dug deeper, they discovered that the collapse hadn't been as catastrophic as initially feared. The original miners have built a series of reinforced sections, creating pockets of stability. Some areas were completely intact, protected by the very engineering that had kept war refugees safe so many years ago. They built it to withstand searches, the historian explained, examining the construction. See how this section is deliberately reinforced. They were protecting something, or someone. The work continued through the morning and into the afternoon. More locals arrived, bringing food and water for the workers. Even some of the skeptics stood watching from a distance, their expressions thoughtful as they observed the community effort. Sarah's arms ached, and her clothes were caked with mud, but she pushed on. Each shovelful of earth cleared felt like uncovering another piece of her family's legacy. Her dog remained enthusiastic, barking encouragingly whenever they made progress. "There's something here," called one of the workers, his shovel hitting something solid. They carefully cleared away the surrounding debris, revealing what appeared to be part of the original tunnel wall. The historian moved in to examine it closely. "This is it. This leads to the chamber we found earlier," he said excitedly. The collapse actually missed the main storage area. "If we can just clear this section." They redoubled their efforts, now working with renewed energy. The dog's excited barking grew more intense as they cleared away the last of the debris. Sarah's heart pounded as the beam of her flashlight penetrated the darkness beyond. There, in the newly cleared space, sat a sealed tin box, and within it, visible through a gap in the lid, was a leather-bound journal, surprisingly well preserved in its metal shelter. The group fell silent, understanding the significance of what they'd found. The historian stepped back, gesturing for Sarah to be the one to reach for it. Her hands trembled slightly as she knelt in the damp earth, her faithful dog pressing close against her side. As her flashlight illuminated what could be the key to understanding her family's true story. Back in the safety of the old house, Sarah sat at her grandmother's worn kitchen table, the rescue journal before her. Max settled at her feet, his warm presence comforting as the evening wind whistled through the eaves. Her hands trembled slightly as she carefully opened the leather cover, mindful of its age. The first page bore elegant handwriting, dated 1942. "My dearest Elizabeth," it began, addressing Sarah's grandmother. "There are things you must know, things I've kept hidden to protect both you and those we sheltered." Sarah's breath caught as she turned the delicate pages. Her great-grandmother's words painted vivid pictures of desperate times. Young men fleeing conscription, orphaned children with nowhere else to go, families torn apart by war. The mine had become their sanctuary. Tonight we brought in 3 more. One entry read, "To brothers, barely 16 and 17 years old, and a girl of 12 who hasn't spoken since losing her parents in the bombing. James helped me prepare the lower chamber while Elizabeth kept watch. The children's eyes hold such fear, yet they found comfort in your daughter's gentle songs." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she read about the intricate system her family had developed. The strange markings on the walls, they were signals, warnings to those who knew how to read them. The carved toys found in the chamber had been made by her great-grandfather to comfort the frightened children during long nights underground. "We seal another section tonight." A later entry detailed, "The authorities grow suspicious. Better to block some tunnels than risk discovery. James says we can still access the hidden chambers." Through the collapse, a final, defensive were ever questioned. The journal revealed how her great-grandparents had used their mining knowledge to create a network of false dead ends and concealed passages. They had risked everything, their reputation, their safety, even their lives, to protect strangers. Sarah paused at an entry that made her heart skip. "Today we nearly lost everything." Officials came with questions about missing persons. Elizabeth, barely 8 years old, saved us all. She played near the sealed shaft, throwing her ball and laughing so naturally that they never suspected what lay beneath. "My brave, precious girl," Max whined softly, sensing her emotion as she read about close calls and midnight rescues. Her great-grandmother's words spoke of neighbors who helped in secret, bringing food and supplies, and others who watched with suspicious eyes, ready to report anything unusual. The hardest part, one passage revealed, is sending them away when it's safe. The children especially, they become part of your heart. But we must remember our purpose is to protect, not to keep. Each successful departure, though it breaks our hearts, is a victory against those who would harm the innocent. As she neared the final pages, Sarah's hands shook harder. The entries grew shorter, more urgent. Her great-grandmother wrote of increasing dangers, of hearing boots on the path above, while dozens huddled silently in the darkness below. Then she found it, the last entry, written in a slightly shakier hand, dated just weeks before her great-grandmother's death. It began differently than all the others. "To my daughter's daughter's child, I write this knowing I may never meet you, but feeling in my heart that someday you will find these words. The mine they call worthless holds more than silver or gold, It holds the echo of courage, of lives saved, of hope preserved in the darkest of times. You who read this are my legacy, more precious than any mineral we could have pulled from these tunnels. The strength that runs in your veins is the same strength that helped us stand firm, when standing firm meant everything. Some will tell you we were traitors for hiding deserters. Others will say we were fools for risking all to save strangers. But I tell you this, there is no higher calling than to protect those who cannot protect themselves. No greater wealth than the knowledge that your actions saved lives. This house, this land, this mine, they are more than property. They are a testament to the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when love demands it. I leave them to you, knowing that somehow, when the time is right, you will understand their true value. Guard these secrets well, but more importantly, guard the spirit that made them necessary. Stand firm in the face of injustice. Offer shelter to those in need. Love fiercely and without reservation. You are my answer to prayers I prayed decades before your birth. My heart knows you, though my eyes never will dot with all my love and faith. Your great-grandmother, Margaret Rose Sullivan. Sarah's vision blurred as tears fell freely now. She clutched the journal to her chest, understanding at last why she had been chosen to inherit this place. Not because she was the only one left, but because something in her great-grandmother's heart had known she would understand. Max pressed closer, resting his head on her knee as she wept, not from sadness, but from a profound sense of connection and purpose. The mine wasn't worthless at all. It was priceless, a testament to courage, compassion, and the difference one family's love could make in the darkest of times. Sarah's hands trembled as she dialed the phone numbers she'd avoided for so long. First her mother, then her Aunt Eleanor, and finally her cousin James. The words came hesitantly at first. Then in a rush as she told them about the mine, the journals, and their family's forgotten legacy of courage. To her surprise, they agreed to come. 3 days later, Sarah stood at the ferry dock, Max at her side, watching familiar faces emerge from the morning mist. Her mother looked older, more fragile than she remembered. Aunt Eleanor's usually perfect hair was windblown, and Cousin James had grown a beard since she'd last seen him. I wasn't sure you'd come, Sarah said softly as they approached. Her mother stepped forward first, arms wrapping around her in a tight embrace. How could we not, after what you told us? Back at the house, Sarah laid out the artifacts on the kitchen table, the carved plank, the locket, the letters, and finally, the journal. Max settled between them, his tail thumping gently against the floor as they gathered around. I remember Grandma Margaret talking about the mine, and Eleanor said, touching the journal's worn cover. But she never told us this. As Sarah read passages aloud, tears began to fall. Her mother's hands shook as she held the locket containing her own childhood photo. All those years I was angry at them for being so secretive, for putting the mine before family. I never knew. None of us knew, James said quietly. We all just assumed the worst. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as decades of misunderstandings and hurt began to heal. Stories emerged, memories of Grandma Margaret's quiet strength, of hints and clues they'd missed or misinterpreted. Remember how she always kept extra food in the pantry? And Eleanor wiped her eyes. We thought she was just being frugal, but she was keeping up the habit from when she fed all those people in hiding. Word spread quickly through the small island community. By evening, locals began arriving at the house, drawn by the story that was rapidly unfolding. Sarah watched in amazement as elderly residents shared their own family tales, connecting pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for generations. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, brought tears to everyone's eyes when she revealed, my grandfather was one of the ones they saved. He was just 16 when they hid him here. If it wasn't for your family, I wouldn't be standing here today. The skepticism that had greeted Sarah's arrival melted away as more stories emerged. The mine that many had dismissed as worthless was suddenly revealed as sacred ground, a symbol of hope and courage that had touched countless lives. Tom Anderson, whose family had lived on the island for 5 generations, stood up in the crowded kitchen. We can't let this history be forgotten, he declared. This mine, these tunnels, they're not just holes in the ground. They're a testament to the best of human nature. Others nodded in agreement. Ideas began flowing, plans to stabilize the mine, to create a proper memorial, to document the stories of those who had found shelter there. We could restore the main tunnel, suggested Bill Matthews, a local contractor. Make it safe for people to see, to understand what happened here. My cousin's an architect, James offered. She specializes in historical preservation. I'm sure she'd help. Sarah watched in wonder as the community she'd once felt rejected by transformed before her eyes. The mine that had been a source of whispers and warnings was becoming a bridge, connecting past to present, neighbor to neighbor. As the evening drew to a close, her mother took her hand. I'm so sorry, Sarah, for not understanding, for letting old hurts keep us apart. Your great-grandmother would be so proud of what you've discovered here. The next day brought more visitors, more stories, more healing. Local craftsmen volunteered to help with the restoration. A historian from the mainland offered to document the testimonies. Children listened wide-eyed as their grandparents revealed long-held family secrets about the role they'd played in the mine's history. As the sun began to set, Sarah slipped away from the bustling house. With Max trotting happily beside her, she walked along the cliff path, the same route her great-grandmother must have taken countless times, while watching for boats carrying precious human cargo. The sea breeze ruffled her hair as she paused at the highest point. Below, waves crashed against the rocks, their rhythm unchanged since the days when frightened families had arrived under cover of darkness. Behind her, lights gleamed from the house windows, where voices and laughter now filled rooms that had been silent for too long. Max pressed against her leg, his warm presence grounding her in the moment. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, remembering how his instincts had first led them to this discovery. You knew all along, didn't you, boy? The dog's tail wagged as he looked up at her with knowing eyes. Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of belonging settle deep in her bones. This place, this island, this house, this community. It wasn't just an inheritance anymore. It was home. Looking out over the darkening water, Sarah felt connected to every person who had ever stood on these cliffs. Those who had waited in fear, those who had offered shelter, those who had kept secrets to protect others. Their courage had created something that transcended time, something that had finally brought her family back together and given her a place where she truly belonged. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as workers began arriving to start the restoration project. Sarah watched from the porch, coffee mug warming her hands, as Max roamed the property with his usual enthusiasm. The dog had been unusually restless since daybreak, pacing and whining at the door until she'd let him out. Suddenly, Max's excited barking drew her attention. He was digging frantically near the old rose bushes that lined the eastern side of the house, dirt flying in all directions. Max, stop that, Sarah called out, setting down her mug. They're about to start work here. But something about his determined pawing made her pause. She'd learned to trust his instincts after everything that had happened. Making her way across the dewy grass, Sarah knelt beside her faithful companion. Max's tail wagged furiously as he continued to dig. And then she saw it. Something wooden peeking through the dark soil. With trembling fingers, Sarah reached into the hole and carefully extracted a small wooden cross, roughly 6 inches tall. Though weathered by time and elements, the craftsmanship was still evident in its careful carving. She brushed away decades of dirt, revealing intricate patterns along its surface. Her heart skipped a beat when she turned it over. There, carved into the base with careful precision, were the initials M.E.H., Margaret Elizabeth Harper, her great-grandmother. Oh my goodness, Sarah whispered, running her fingers over the letters. Max sat beside her, panting proudly, seeming to understand the significance of his discovery. The morning light caught the cross's worn surface, highlighting spots where countless hands must have held it in prayer or contemplation. Sarah could almost feel the weight of history radiating from its simple form. She carried it inside, past the construction workers who were reviewing restoration plans. In the kitchen, she carefully cleaned it with a soft cloth, revealing more details in the wood. Besides the initials, there were small crosses carved along the arms, and what appeared to be a date, though much of it had worn away. Sarah called her mother, who arrived within the hour. Ellen's eyes filled with tears when she saw the cross. I remember this, she said softly, taking it in her hands. Grandma Margaret used to hold it during evening prayers. She told me once it was made from wood taken from the original mine supports. The revelation added another layer of meaning to the discovery. This wasn't just a religious symbol. It was a physical link to the mine's history, to the people who had found sanctuary there. Throughout the day, as workers began the careful process of securing the mine entrance, Sarah kept the cross close. She found herself holding it while reviewing restoration plans. During conversations with the Historical Society, and in quiet moments between tasks stopped by late afternoon, clouds had rolled in from the sea, bringing with them a cool breeze that carried the scent of salt and approaching rain. Sarah felt drawn to the cliffs, the same way she'd seen her great-grandmother pulled there in old photographs. Max followed as she made her way along the familiar path. The waves below crashed against the rocks with increasing force, their rhythm matching the beating of her heart. She found herself thinking about Margaret, about the weight she must have carried, not just the physical cross, but the burden of so many secrets, so many lives in her care. Standing at the cliff's edge, Sarah held the cross tightly. Everything had changed since she'd first arrived on the island, feeling lost and unwanted. The inheritance she'd thought worthless had turned out to be more valuable. than she could have imagined, not in gold or gems, but in courage, love, and sacrifice. Tears began rolling down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of understanding, of finally knowing where she belonged. The cross in her hands connected her to something larger than herself, to a legacy of compassion and bravery that would now live on through the restored mind and the stories it would tell. Sarah raised the cross toward the churning sea, feeling the wind wrap around her like an embrace. Max pressed against her legs, steady and loyal, just as he'd been since the beginning of their journey. The waves crashed below, their eternal rhythm a reminder that some things like faith, courage, and love endured beyond time. In that moment, past and present seemed to merge. She could almost see them all, the frightened family seeking shelter, her great-grandmother standing watch on these very cliffs, the generations that had kept these secrets safe. Their strength flowed through the wooden cross into her heart, filling her with a peace she'd never known before. The inheritance that had once seemed worthless had given her something beyond price, a new life filled with purpose and meaning, a home where she truly belonged, and a legacy she would proudly carry forward. Max barked softly beside her, his tail wagging as the first drops of rain began to fall. Sarah clutched the cross close to her heart, feeling its worn surface press against her palm, a tangible reminder of all that had been lost and found, hidden and revealed, broken and healed on this remarkable island. If even one moment stayed with you, hit subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story written gently for the heart.